Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me. And congratulations on getting this book published. It's no small achievement. And I thought there's a lot to this book. And I thought one of the things we could discuss first, or really focus on, would be one of the chapters and one of the characters. Characters is really why we all have stuck around in oncology as long as we have. So the character I'm thinking about is John Yarbrough. And this is, to me, a fascinating chapter because, of course, I knew John and all of us knew John, but this is like, what is his job in 1971? What does he do, and when does he leave? So let's talk about him.
Yeah, we're happy to be here, Paul, and we were really lucky to not only have spoken with John, as it turns out, very shortly before he became ill and his death, but then in follow-up, his wife, Connie Yarbrough, who is a contributor to cancer history in her own right as one of the co-founders of ONS and a distinguished nurse educator. And learning what John's background was, and then coming across documents that we'll talk about in a little bit, was a real treasure and a real a highlight for both Eric and I. I'm sure I could speak for Eric in writing the book.
What was interesting, Paul, was when we identified John originally, it was as one of the people who testified in favor of the National Cancer Act. And we weren't that familiar with his background at that point in time. We had realized, through the digging, we saw that at that point in time, when he was testifying, he was at the precursor of Fox Chase Cancer Center and testifying on their behalf. It was only after we spoke to him and Connie, we found out that he also had been the first director of the National Cancer Center's program, which made his value even greater than before. And we were able to speak with him, as Skip said, and Connie, right before he took ill. And we continued our conversations with Connie, who also shared really valuable information from John's archives about his observations about the original cancer centers when they were actually trying to be put in for a designation.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, well, yeah, when you think about National Cancer Act, people think, well, it's about cancer research. Yeah, it is, but it's also a public health measure. And it's easy to forget that it is what it is, that it is that. So here's John as head of the first cancer centers branch head, or whatever it was called then. What was it called?
Among the things that's hard to pin down are a lot of the details of the early history of the National Cancer Program, Paul. I believe it was the Center for Cancer Centers, or the branch for cancer centers, but it's not entirely clear.
The nomenclature, as you know, Paul, changes quite a bit over the years with each subsequent bureaucracy at NCI, and they're constantly renaming their different offices into different variations.
So what's John's job? 1971, we roll back to 72, right? When did he come in? Do we know?
Well, I think it's important to start even a little before then, Paul, because a point that I think very few people know, I would hazard a guess, is that, as Eric mentioned, John testified in the hearings leading up to the passage of the NCI, of the National Cancer Act. So John was one of the experts called, because at that time he was head of medical oncology at what was to evolve to be Fox Chase, but at that time he was head of medical oncology at American Oncologic Hospital, closely associated physically with the Institute for Cancer Research. And John was obviously an advocate for the NCA and cancer centers and all that the NCA was hoping to accomplish. But John pointed out that it's time that the the public and the federal government paid more attention to cancer because he noted, and he did the calculations of abstracts presented at the Federation meetings in Atlantic City, noting that the cancer was disproportionately underrepresented as a discipline, disproportionate to the mortality rates from cancer compared to heart disease. So John was one of the first I came across who pointed out that in the 60s and early 70s, inadequate attention was being paid to cancer and targeted to this relationship between number of abstracts on heart disease versus cancer research at the Federation meetings.
That's called Disease Olympics, I believe.
Yeah.
He is one of the founders of Disease Olympics.
Yep.
But so he comes into this job, right? Here's this guy sitting at a government desk in Bethesda, and he's a former cancer centers guy, even before there is a cancer centers program. And his job is to do what? To identify cancer centers, not
And evaluate whether or not they will have the credential, have the what was essential to become a cancer center as the National Cancer Act had defined it. And that was just one thing I want to say, Paul, just backing up a little bit. One of the challenges we had was we wanted to speak to as many people as possible who were around when the National Cancer Act was being passed. And that became a challenge because you had to be relatively senior at that point to be involved in this, which would place most of those individuals in their late 80s or 90s. And John was one of the few people we met. Joe Bertino had been another one. Who was around at that time. But the other thing was, I remember conversations I had with good friend Jim Holland 11 years ago about the National Cancer Act, and Jim was one of the people who helped sign it. And I never took notes back then because I never knew we would be going to this depth and I think Skip and I both had that experience, having spoken with so many people who were involved at the beginning, but who are no longer with us, and not having. We have a memory of what they said, but not exactly what they said.
Mm-hmm. No, I know exactly what you're talking about because I've done the same things, and was not didn't have the foresight to keep notes, but we still had pretty good view of what happened.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And having just seen the people involved means a lot. But let's go back to John. So his job is to sit there and figure out which cancer center gets the designation. So his first were I know we've sparred on the subject. What were the first ones, as far as you could tell, based on that memo? I think it's 3.
Well, yeah, the sparring you referred to, Paul, gets back to the uncertainty Eric alluded to as to records at the NCI. What we were really fortunate to be able to review, thanks to the kindness of Connie Yarbrough, was a series of notes that John put together. The notes are undated, and it's only by inference that one can estimate what they were for. They were titled Notes to File. My hypothesis is that John wrote these notes in the late 70s, or in the 74, late 74, early 75, as he was preparing to transition out of the job as head of the Cancer Center's office at the NCI to become the director at the University of Missouri Ellis Fischel program. But when one looks at the documents that are available, our best estimate is that at the time the NCA was passed, the National Cancer Institute judged that the Roswell Park, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and the MD Anderson met the criteria for comprehensive cancer centers. So they existed at the passage of the NCA. The sequence in which others accomplished that goal or that title is a little bit murky.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. So I guess we're in complete agreement. So sparring notwithstanding, that's exactly what we saw. And that's another question. People forget that in 1971, there weren't that many oncologists.
And most of them weren't oncologists because that discipline really didn't exist in 1971.
Exactly.
Pathologists like Sidney Farber and radiologists like Henry Kaplan. So yeah, it's another part of this story is the evolution of the various specialties, and now we've segmented ourselves into subspecialties. But we forget that in 1971, there were only a handful of people who bothered to focus their career energy on cancer.
And then there was all the politics involved within medical schools and medical organizations, resistance to having cancer centers or cancer come forward as a separate discipline. The hematologists were opposed to that, as having cancer centers versus what they called cancer programs. And it was just an uphill battle. I mean, there were organizations which are great supporters today of the National Cancer Act, such as the AACR, which was opposed to it at that point in time. However, what was interesting was its president at that time, Jim Holland, was one of the people who, even though he's president of AACR, he was on the other side of the tabulation who was voting for it and in favor of it. So it was just a lot of strife in terms of the medical preceding oncopolitics. This is meadow politics,
Sure.
and the politics that was actually going on in Washington to get the act passed. One of the other obstacles we found was the lack of records. We contacted NCI a number of times to find out when various cancer centers were designated or when they had received their planning grants. And what we learned was there was a federal mandate that all records management mandate destroying all records every 7 years in federal offices, including HHS and NCI. And we really couldn't believe it. And we kept asking different people, including we even asked Ned Sharpless in one discussion. He was unaware of that. So we had to go back to the cancer center program directors in the past and rely on their memories as to what actually happened. And one of those people was Linda Weiss, who gave her observations about the cancer centers and what was happening with them and the formation of them. And she basically also said that that NCI fudged in certain issues in terms of answering the questions. They didn't know who was first or what was a cancer center. Again, most of the cancer centers that evolved later many of them started out as either independent hospitals or research centers. There were very few that were combined as academic medical research centers or comprehensive cancer centers. Memorial Sloan Kettering, Roswell Park, Fox Chase, many of the earlier ones were different institutions that came together to form the cancer center. All the disciplines.
Right. Yeah, no, but so let's go back to John. That everything you've just said makes that memo, that long memo that you're quoting at length and that we would love to be able to post in the Cancer History Project, all the more valuable, because here's this guy who is sitting there and saying, well, I have real problems with this place, or this place has this potential to do this, and this place doesn't have any potential for anything. It's just sort of a fascinating memo. Can you talk about the memo more?
I think
one of the striking things, if you reflect on some of the things John said and what the stated purpose of the center's program is, folks often forget that cancer centers are designated because they achieve a certain level of excellence in cancer research, clinical research, population research. And there's never a measurement or a specific evaluation of the care of cancer patients. It's expected that the care would be great, and it's expected that the region would be impacted. But John, on at least one very clear occasion in his series of notes, made the observation that if a certain center that he was criticizing disappeared tomorrow, there would be no noticeable change in the terrible cancer care that was being received by the patients in that region, implying with or without the center, the care was not so good and that the center needed to get its act together.
And he also indicated in certain cases that if certain cancer center directors were no longer at the helm of that cancer center would cease to exist.
Give me some examples or what's your favorite part of it? Is there anything you want to repeat?
Denny Hammond and USC. John basically said if Hammond were to leave, the center at USC would dissolve. He also recounted the story of Rochester and its attempts, which apparently were fairly vigorous in the late 60s, early 70s to develop a cancer center. But then Dr. Tom Hall left Rochester, and in John's words, the effort dissolved, and there was nothing left of the foregoing organization.
Well, leadership matters, to quote Joe Simone, as one always should.
Yes.
Fascinating. So that explains that why when you've seen one cancer center, you've seen one cancer center.
Right.
And Joe looms large in our book also. We have quite a number of, we have interviews with him. The other thing is, and Skip, we're not really sure who has ever seen these notes. Isn't that true? I mean, as far as we're concerned, we may have been the first to unveil it. And Paul, if you put into your history project, that may be the first time they all see the light of day. Because we're not sure where they went or if they even made it to the NCI leadership afterwards.
My guess is that nobody ever saw them. Because it's something like this, it's a note to the file. Why would you show it to anybody? It's just something that you do out of just probably act of frustration, right?
My fantasy was that John was writing these for his successor to sort of give him an orientation opinion of John Yarbrough. But you're quite right. If he did that, these were then copies of what he gave to his successor. So we have, I think it's a fair hypothesis that this is the first time these have come to light, certainly publicly.
Even if a lot of the observations were subjective, and we don't know whether they were or weren't, we do know at least they're coming from somebody who is in a position to view cancer centers. So it's fascinating just in and of themselves to see what he was saying and what he was saying about different centers and different individuals.
I knew him as when he was one of the leaders of ACCC. So he was really kind of more interested in community centers, which is sort of a fascinating idea because I would have met him around, I would say, 1986. So it's a whole different phase. How do you go from that phase, from the sort of the academic cancer centers phase to the community cancer centers phase? Did you get that sense about him? Why? What's the trend? Well, how?
No, and that's a very important concept, Paul, I think, because originally the main reason I wanted to talk to John was to explore his transition from the NCI to Ellis, Fischel, and Missouri, and what the barriers and hurdles he found at Missouri in achieving NCI designation. I mean, unfortunately, in the midst of our interview, John got ill, and we never really finished anywhere near as much of an in-depth discussion as we would have liked. I can only imagine that the difficulty in assembling the support necessary for an NCI application at Missouri and Ellis Fischel that John ran into that seems to persist to this day led him to focus rather than on academic, scientifically oriented cancer center on trying to organize cancer care and in the community and to develop a strong community-based program.
That's an interesting bit of insight about his evolution, because I never would have even thought that he was the director of the Cancer Centers program at NCI. I knew him as this guy who was very, he was pretty funny, but in a very kind of a prickly and scary, in a sense, way, if you don't know that he's a good guy, you know? Because he had
As
that humor.
as I noted earlier, when we spoke with him originally, we didn't know that either. Again,
Right.
he came versus having testified for the National Cancer Act, and then knowing his background at the American Oncologic Hospital. But when that came up, all of a sudden light bulbs started blowing up all over our heads when we found that out, because that was a dimension that was more critical than anything else that we had known about him, or most people we spoke with. If he had a bird's eye view of the Cancer Centers program as it was being created.
My God. And here you are, here you find an amazing document that nobody, even people who knew him, knew about. That's one of
The striking thing in the document, Paul, is that in 1974, 75, whatever, almost certainly that was the time frame, John summarized the challenges and problems that confronted those seeking to develop cancer centers for the next 50 years. He pointed out in several of his commentaries that lack of support by the dean was going to be a problem at this center. Lack of resource commitment to establish independent space was going to be a problem. He criticized one very prominent center early on, Johns Hopkins, noting that Al Owens, who was the founding director at Johns Hopkins, was not thinking sufficiently broadly to develop a broad cancer research program, and was focused on more narrow topics, which I think is a fair criticism looking back at the history of how Hopkins developed. So John, if you read what he wrote carefully, he captured the zeitgeist of developing a cancer center very early in that history.
And he
Well,
didn't pull many punches.
Go ahead, Eric.
I'm saying, and he didn't pull many punches when doing it. He's
Right.
very explicit about how he thinks and how he feels, which makes it all the more, well, it's colorful, but it also seems much more real, because it's not a bureaucratic rendering of an analysis. It's basically his observations on what he's seeing and what's coming to him in terms of proposals for cancer centers.
Well, also we just skipped right over it, but this whole genre of a memo to a file is, you're writing an intimate note about programs to your filing cabinet and putting it under, probably misfiling it deliberately so nobody would find it, God forbid, right? So you kind of found a Rosetta Stone or some such.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do you ever see them? I know only one memo to file that I've ever read, and that was about in the midst of the NSABP scandal, right? I mean, Skip never wrote one of those. Have you ever written a memo to file?
Well, yeah, I have on occasion, but it's usually for HR concerns, not historical or organizational concerns.
Well, again, when we were talking to him and Connie, and by the way, it was during that initial interview that he had his first episode, and he had to get off the phone. And Connie said to us, "John is not is ill. We have to get off." We followed up with Connie the next day to see how he was doing and she was doing, and we found out he had been hospitalized. And it was a few weeks later that he passed away. However, Connie wanted to continue, and she, as I said, as we said before, not only as the spouse of somebody who was walking through history by his side, but somebody who was also involved in the history of oncology nursing, which also followed the history of oncology in those days, continue talking to us, and she was the one who shared these things. When we first saw that, I said to Skip, "This is pure gold." I mean, we didn't expect anything to unearth something like this, but we did.
Tell me,
and you'll help bring more of it to light.
Oh, this would be amazing. Tell me more about what did he die of? What was the episode?
Well, we didn't delve into detail, but I think it was a cerebrovascular accident that caused the termination of our phone call, and presumably it was continuing neurologic difficulties from that.
Oh my, good
It's-
God. So you really got him at the right moment, literally.
Well, and as Eric alluded to, I mean, it really is a striking illustration of how the history of the center's program and the NCI is slowly, well, maybe not so slowly, ebbing away as these founders and giants who were there at the beginning are no longer with us. So that plus the observation that Eric made about the lack of documentation. One of the points that we emphasize whenever we get a chance is that institutions should keep track of what they've been doing, because someday somebody's going to want to look back at it. And it's interesting how little attention most places spend on that, on the history of their entity.
Three of us have also been very, I will say, blessed and honored to have been in contact with so many of these individuals over the decades, knowing firsthand, becoming friends with many of them. And that's really helped us enrich the book, because we knew the people we were writing about, even if they were no longer with us. But it's also serendipity, as you know, you and I, Paul, are among the very few people who have written over the years for a larger audience about the biographies of these founders of oncology. And a lot of it's serendipity. I remember when I last spoke with Jimmy Holland, which was probably her last interview. At that point, she told me to interview Jim, before I interviewed her, because she didn't think Jim Holland was going to last that long. And then she predeceased him. But it was just, it's just a matter of the timing that makes it so, well, fortunate and unfortunate at the same time.
Well, we're definitely are privileged, all three of us, that we did know many of those people, because you've seen the person, you can actually kind of have a better sense of how to write about them.
Joe Simone was another example of somebody who died during the course of our interview, of our writing this book. Joe Simone.
Joe, yeah. Well, let's go back to Joe for a moment. And this is picking up also on something Skip just said. Joe's line that if you've seen one cancer center, you've seen one cancer center. Is that becoming more homogenized? Is there more of a standardization? Are you seeing? Are they becoming sort of, if not one cancer, if seen one type of a cancer, so one group of cancer centers? Is there a homogenization of them? And of course, Skip has run many cancer centers of many different kinds. Tell us.
I guess my view would be that the Simone maxim persists, that the models continue to evolve, and yes, there is standardization, some of which is good and has been incited by the desires of the NCI. Some of the standardization maybe not so good, but all in all, I think each center has its own ethic, its own pressures and challenges. In general, you've got to have the support of the dean in order to have a successful cancer center, but that support can be developed in many, many different ways, and using various forms of persuasion that can be developed in other parts of the community. So yeah, I think the Simone maxim continues to be a truism.
Well, I agree, but I think there are more cancer centers being created which are similar to other cancer centers. You don't have some of the vast differences. One of the things that the National Cancer Act talked about was creating 15 new centers, and the model they were looking at was the model of Roswell Park, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and MD Anderson in those days, which were really freestanding institutions that combined basic clinical and prevention research under one roof. And as Skip and I have noted, very few institutions have been created as freestanding since then. Most of them have been matrix of one sort or another, but they also seem to be working. The other thing that John kept pursuing, and we've mentioned this several times, is the need to have independence of a board, independence of the dean, and basically a ranking among peers of the cancer center director with other authorities within within the medical complex. And that has absolutely proven to be true over the years. If you want to get things done, you have to have some control.
But there was also in his era, the beginnings of a lot of consortium cancer centers. And that's an interesting idea too.
Attempts.
Yes.
Yes.
Attempts. No.
Well, it was about 10 years of attempts, and then NCI put a kibosh on it pretty much. About 15 years, actually.
Well, but in John's original notes, he notes both the potential advantages as well as the challenges of the Illinois Cancer Council, which was a consortium of Northwestern, Chicago, and Rush. And an example very early on of an attempted consortium model that two of those three institutions subsequently, fairly quickly, went on to get the independent designation. But in the shortly after the passage of the NCA, they were working on a consortium model that didn't work.
So was California, right? Northern California.
Right. Yeah,
And then
later.
Yeah, later a little bit, but
Later.
The Illinois Cancer Council ran out of money. Basically, that was the problem there, right? The state money dried up.
I think that's right, and again, it emphasizes the critical importance of ongoing support, often political support. With that model, it required somebody extra institutional to maintain the support, which didn't happen.
And you also, I think, Michigan Cancer Foundation and the consolidation of Wayne State and others, and what it took, even in Philadelphia, and he was familiar with what became Fox Chase. He talks about the fact that it was originally the Fox Chase University of Pennsylvania grant that was going in. And he also noted that, did many of these cities need more than one cancer center? But he also noted which entity of these conglomerations had strengths and which had weaknesses, which may have had a strong clinical presence but no basic research presence. And so he really, in today's light, it really was very insightful in terms of how he looked at what it took to become a full-fledged comprehensive cancer center.
Is there, that's what I loved about that chapter, but is there a reason, is there a need for more cancer centers right now? Because the original idea was to have regional representation of these cancer centers that are going to be taking care of people as we find the cures, and they'll just be curing them and they'll be going on along their way. But right now, 50 years later, do we need more cancer centers? I know there are lots being considered right now, at least by their directors. Applications are going in. Will they be approved?
We have a chapter, what we call the newest kids on the cancer center block. And we looked at the last 5 cancer centers to get designation. This was from, I think, 2012. 3 of them were 2 of them had been designated as comprehensive in the past, lost their designation, and that was Mount Sinai and Sylvester Cancer Center, and then got a designation back, but not a comprehensive designation. But 3 of them, Kansas, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, all of which had been underserved areas, all of which had large areas that had no NCI-designated cancer centers. But it wasn't until they could meet the criteria that was necessary in the basic prevention and clinical sides that they got that designation. So we chronicle a little bit how they built up those different divisions to become into compliance with what it took to become designated. There are other areas of this country which have a great lack of any identity of any cancer center nearby, and where but part of that was, well, let me get back. When Mount Sinai tried to become designated again, it was back in, when was that, Skip, in the early 2000s?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
When they were trying to get designated, there were times when they were running against the fact that there were a whole bunch of cancer centers already in New York. And we have a story in there when some cancer center directors bumped into Varmus when he was still at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he thought that they would have a hard time gaining designation because they were New York City based. But to a large degree, they got that designation because they served an underserved area that no
Right.
one else was reaching in New York.
Right, because I mean,
And
even though, yeah, they were,
And that's part of the mission, to be able to reach out to those communities.
right. No,
Exactly.
it's very important. The most important thing that's probably happened in cancer centers is outreach and engagement component, because that was sort of there, but then suddenly it became very important. Who does Skip? Whom would you give credit for that? For that rather? Whom would you say who made it happen? I think it's Doug Lowy.
Well, certainly Doug played an important role in the contemporaneous with the development of the emphasis on outreach and engagement. So that you're probably right, Paul.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to reflect on the history. There are still swaths of the country that are not covered by a cancer center, whether it's cause and effect or not, but some of those parts of the country are among those that have the worst outcomes in some cancers that we clearly recognize as preventable, like cervical cancer.
Mhm.
And cancer centers that were the newest kids on the block, Oklahoma and Kentucky, both through their cancer center directors, had noted they were among the poorest states with very high mortality in a lot of cancers. So those were states that really could use that sort of presence. The question is, in those other states that are still without a cancer center, what can be done to bring that type of excellence to that state or that community?
I guess
And
you could expand catchment areas. You could play with catchment areas, but I mean, I'm not smart enough to suggest anything about the way to deal with it. But what I am wondering about is whether the program has reached the point where there's not much need for cancer centers, or my own sort of instinct from just covering the field is the more the merrier.
I think that's true, Paul. Your latter statement, the more the merrier, because as long as a candidate new center has the requisite scientific excellence and provides a unique component to solving a regional cancer problem, I don't think there's any reason that because of some absolute concern about numbers, there should be a barrier put up.
And remember, we have comprehensive cancer centers and cancer centers which don't have a comprehensive status, which can still serve can still serve that community, but do not have the full measure of capabilities to be designated as comprehensive. So that's a sort of a step towards at least meeting that need. With that, but every cancer center director we spoke with, after they get their designation, they all have their plans. When are we going to go for the comprehensive designation? And the question is, why is that as important as doing a good job just serving your public?
Well, what about hybrid cancer centers? I'm asking this because, of course, you guys are all into hybrid cancer centers. Is that happening still? Is that
Well, that came out of a series that I had done for MedPay Today, and actually that was, and when I started observing that there seemed to be a number of academic leaders who left NCI designated comprehensive cancer centers and were going to large community cancer centers or large community hospitals. Skip was one of the people that I had thought of because he had made the move from Roswell Park to Inova. And so at that point, several years ago, we put actually a conference together, bringing together a number of the hybrid cancer center leaders. And the hybrid academic cancer center basically is a cancer center that's within a large community hospital system, but is striving to reach more academic excellence and go beyond.
I think it kind of came out of Derek Ragavan's brain. That's kind of the way I think of it. But he did come up with this idea, and he was the first person to really start truly engineering it, although there are, of course.
And Nick Petrelli also.
It's a complicated story, though, because John Yarbrough went to Missouri and Ellis Fischel, presumably to build a cancer center. And for whatever reason, probably politics and limited community support and university support, he was not able to do that. In a similar vein, several folks, including me, have gone to very successful community-based centers, hoping to develop what has been called a hybrid center, and some have been extremely successful. Others not so much, and I think a common feature is the extent to which community, institutional, philanthropic, sometimes even government support can be brought to bear. And in the history of other centers, Oklahoma had a run at center development with a very successful senior cancer person moving there to get them NCI designation, Howard Ozer, and that could just not be brought together. In talking with the folks at Oklahoma for the book, I think it's clear that new support and new enthusiasm emerged outside the cancer center that allowed things to happen. And there are other examples of successful folks going to programs, hoping to build a center, and then the resources just don't come together in that region.
Well, we revisited a number of the centers that we had labeled as hybrid several years ago, and I'd say about half of them were no longer pursuing that goal because they had lost. Basically, unless you have the CEO of the hospital system fully behind you, it's not going to work. And there was a clash of cultures between academic and community cancer centers, and to some degree, one wonders how much that played a part in not allowing the fruition of the academic part. The other example was University of Miami. Who was it who came down from NCI, Skip?
Oh, Gordon Zubrod.
Gordon Zubrod left NCI, went to Miami, and almost automatically they became designated as an NCI center. So one wonders how much was the old boys network, how much was politics. Though it's interesting in talking to a number of the cancer center directors whose centers were newly designated, they all pointed out that there was no preference given to them by political leaders, congressmen, senators in their state, that they had to earn their accreditation the old-fashioned way by basically having everything in place, not the favor of a politician.
And that loops us back to Yarbrough, because there are two centers that appear in Yarbrough's notes, wherein John expressed the biggest problem that he had with those centers. I think this was the Hutchinson Cancer Center and Hahnemann, was that the director was closely connected to a powerful political personality in the region who made life very difficult for the personnel in the cancer center's office that John oversaw. In the case of the Hutch, the politician who was of importance was Magnuson in Washington, and John concludes that he decided that it's easier just to go along with the political pressure than to waste energy trying to, you could infer, do the right thing. So it stands in contrast to what at least we were able to get from the current center directors, who maintain that, and I'm sure this is true, that there's not no political influence in centers designation, but centers are pretty well insulated, I think, from overt day-to-day influence.
I think a few
If you
directors
look at
also.
the National Cancer Act, I mean, it's a fool's errand to separate politics from oncology.
Right.
Because that's, Mary Lasker, and going back to all of that is, the whole thing is very political. So, and did it not work? Of course it worked.
Yep.
Speaking of which, I maybe we should just re-examine the credit for this, one of the oncology zingers, that every cancer center has 2 senators and a variable number of House members. Is that, that's a Vince DeVita line? At least that's where I heard it, but have you heard it from anywhere else?
No, that didn't come up in our, at least that I recall, in our delving into the history.
But we did hear NCI directors talk about getting frequent calls from senators and others about put his cancer center in their state. But Mary Lasker was, I mean, that her role was critical also. And here you had not only a public-private effort that was create a successful National Cancer Act, but a bipartisan effort. I mean, just within the Lasker home, Mary was Democrat, and her husband Albert was a staunch Republican, and they were the major backers of the American Cancer Society in those days, and then the creation of the National Cancer Act.
Sure. They had that divide running through there, but it was also a different time. So,
oh, absolutely,
as
yes.
much of a divide as it appears today. But it's, yeah.
And I know you all know this, but the other point to mention about Mary Lasker and the Laskers was that their influence was well past just cancer. I mean, they were advocates for national health insurance, advocates for mental health legislation. Mary was the first layperson appointed to NCI or an NIH advisory panel when she was appointed to the panel for the newly created Heart Institute. So it's really remarkable the impact that they had on biomedical research and care.
As well as Nancy, Mary was very involved in city beautification, and a lot of. And the other interesting thing is, I mean, Albert Lasker's advertising career, which made his fortunes, you know, he was one who promoted Lucky Strikes, and yet the Laskers took lots of money later in anti-tobacco efforts. So a lot of interesting.
It's all true. And yes, and I'm glad we've. Is there anything we forgot? Anything we'd like to mention? I know we could talk for 2 or 3 days and never lose steam. But is there anything about John? Anything about that era that we forgot to mention that you'd like to bring up now?
No, but there was just one other little thing, and that is we had a chapter where we asked many of the luminaries in cancer research and oncology world what they thought were the 3 to 5 most significant advances in cancer research over the last 50 years. And that was very insightful also, because you had basic scientists who were talking about certain population science advances, and it was just good to see that people weren't staying strictly within their tract, but basically looking at the cancer problem universally.
And I think looping back to John, we can often forget that John had a very successful career in pharmacology, clinical pharmacology, early studies in cancer drugs. So John was, in fact, an administrator who committed some very interesting comments to paper, but also a clinician and a clinician investigator.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with the book. Here it is.
Thanks, Paul.